But of course, what I would love to do now, and I'm happy that we've got Cind Du Bois, because of course, talking about stagflation, and I'm not a specialist, and maybe some of you aren't even in all of those economic phenomenons. It's, I think, good in this next session to a bit explain what is stagflation and what could be the impact before the other experts will start to bring it more into our used car market and what we do in used cars. So, Sind, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I will give the word to you, and if you can share the screen, and then we can see your presentation. And
No, just
yeah, voila. I think it's on right now, so it's all
okay.
yours. You're okay?
Yes, thank you very
Thanks a
much,
lot, Tim.
Johan.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you for having me today and for inviting me to speak on this event with a very lively topic. And going over the list with the other speakers and experts, I have to admit I feel a bit like the odd one out here since I'm not an expert in the sector. I'm just an academic who happens to know something about economics. Nevertheless, I promise to the organizers not to go into too many technical details and to refrain from overly technical models and boring figures. So let's start. So first of all, what is inflation? Well, it's a toxic mix of inflation and stagnation. And this is a definition, so every word in a definition is per definition important. But here, two words stand out, and that is inflation and stagnation. What is inflation? Well, whether we're a car producer or a private consumer, today we all feel what inflation is at first hand, rising prices everywhere. The latest estimates for the Eurozone indicate a price increase for more than 8% in May 2022, which again rose compared to April 2022. Now, in order to stick to my promise and not to overload you with some boring numbers, I've chosen to visualize inflation today on the world map. And if we can interpret the 2% that the ECB handles, as well as the Federal Reserve Central Bank, as a safe inflation rate, we can see here that there are only a few countries in the world that have this, or that in this safe zone today. These are the green countries on the world map. And what do you see? It's, except for some African countries such as, I think, Gabon and Cameroon, there are two countries that stand out. That is, on the one hand side, the bigger one, China, and on the other hand, you also have Saudi Arabia. So these two countries were the only countries that in April 22, so last month, actually noted down inflation rates more or less around 2%, which is a safe inflation rate zone. Now, these two countries are actually real good examples of the causes of the inflations today. We know that last month, China, or a big part of China, was in a severe lockdown. So people couldn't buy things, and that is why inflation rates were low. And Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, well, this is a country who is rather independent from energy, from oil, and as we know, rising oil prices are one of the main causes of the inflation, the high inflation rates of today. So except for these few green exceptions, the world today seems to color orange. And the darker the color here, the higher the inflation rate. And we see some very dark orange countries such as Argentina, Venezuela, who stopped, like I think last year, stopped announcing their inflation rates, but also countries such as Turkey. Now, all the other countries, also the Western countries, they all color orange, which means that they have higher than targeted inflation rates, indicating thus inflation worldwide. Now, it's a mix of inflation on the one hand and stagnation on the other hand. So normally, if we see inflation, this usually goes hand in hand with high economic growth. And you could say that the higher prices, they reflect overheated economies, and the high economic growth really backs a bit the high price increases. What we see today is actually not the same situation. We have inflation, but we also see that our world economic growth is slowing down. Actually, what we see here is the GDP, the real GDP growth over time, and we see the deep decrease in the COVID year 2020. And today we are all already back at pre-COVID levels, but we see that our economic growth is decreasing, is slowing down. And actually, last week, the World Bank published their new report, and they negatively adjusted the growth forecast for 2022 to 2.9%. In January, they still forecasted it to be 4%. So we're in, you could say, the perfect storm. Maybe perfect is not the best word in this situation. So the combination is toxic, which brings me to the third most important word of the definition, toxic. Why is it toxic? Well, it's toxic because the remedy for one phenomenon, inflation, strengthens the other phenomenon, economic stagnation. Or, as one of my colleagues stated, recession is a measure for inflation. Because in order to curb inflation, we have to allow some economic recession, which poses a dilemma for policymakers worldwide. Roughly speaking, you could say that you have two sources of inflation. On the one hand side, you have demand increases, for example, the recovery after the COVID pandemic. And on the other hand, we have supply shocks, like the supply chain bottlenecks we have incurred the last months, the invasion in Ukraine, etc., etc. And depending on the source of inflation, you need a different cure. Now let's see what happens if inflation is a consequence of increased demand. For example, suppose that we just had a severe lockdown, we can all go out, we can buy cars, we can buy stuff. What happens on our graph is we see that our demand curve shifts to the right. It's not shifting, but it's supposed to shift to the right. And if it shifts to the right, then you can see that this leads to a price increase. Now it leads to a price increase, but as you see on the graph, the price increase is backed by an increase in quantity as well, where we want to buy more stuff. Now, suppose as a policymaker, you want to mitigate this price increase, what you could do is you could increase the interest rate by making it more expensive to borrow money. So by increasing the interest rate, you want to mitigate, you want to slow down the demand increase. Now, suppose on the other hand that inflation is a consequence of a supply shock. Suppose, like we had after COVID, some supply bottlenecks, that the supply curve shifts to the left. Now, if our supply decreases and our supply curve shifts to the left, then we also see a price increase on our graph. But we see that this price increase is not backed by economic growth. Okay. So here you see that we have a price increase, but no increase in quantity. Now, what is the solution here? Suppose in this situation that we're going to increase the interest rates in order to curb inflation. If we do that, then we will decrease the demand curve, which will, of course, curb inflation, but it will, on the other hand, also decrease the quantity. So that is why recession is the answer for inflation, but it's a very painful answer, let's say. Now, what we see today in the US, the Federal Reserve Bank has already decided to increase interest rates, also Canada, for example, and the European Central Bank last week decided that they will start increasing their interest rate as from July this year. I think it's the first time since 11 years or something that they will increase the interest rate. The question is, what will be the consequence here? Okay. Now, the $1 million question, you could say, today is, can we compare today's situation with the 70s? In the 70s, we had the two oil crises. We had price increasing enormously, and policymakers responded by increasing interest rates enormously. But in that situation, you had a lot of countries with high debt levels. And if, of course, you are confronted with a high debt level and interest rates increase, you have problems by in repaying your debt. The question is Are we in the same situation? Because if this is so, this is of course devastating for the economy as well on a micro level as on a macro level. Now, it's a $1 million question, and I don't have the $1 million answer, I'm afraid. And if I would probably be doing something else right now. But as it's often the case with economic questions, there's always at the one hand and on the other hand. Here, on the one hand, we could say that today is different from the 70s. Why? Because we have credible monetary policy institutions. We have the Federal Reserve, we have the European Central Bank. They are experienced with monetary policy. Markets believe in them, and they react. They don't overreact on decisions they make, which is a difference with the 70s. We also have flexible markets, and maybe we don't feel it that way today, but if we translate the oil prices today in real terms and we compare it to the prices in the 70s, we see that the oil prices today are only 2/3 of what they were in the 80s. So maybe we don't feel it that way, but the shocks are smaller today. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are some indicators that could lead us to conclude that we are a bit in a situation like the 70s. Also now today, there are a lot of countries with high debt levels, which who are in danger if interest prices or if interest rates are going to increase, especially those countries with high debt levels in foreign valuta are very vulnerable. And as I already mentioned, there are prospects for weaker economic growth, as, for example, the World Bank negatively adjusted their GDP growth estimates for this year and the year to come. So, what are the consequences and what can we expect? Well, we don't have a crystal ball, and if there's any economist who tells you that he has, you shouldn't believe him or her. But the current situation challenges our economic models. The invasion in Ukraine, the pandemic, etc. That we didn't have those variables in our theoretical models. I think we can still distract three important factors that remain to be followed for every sector, not only your sector. The first one is the effect of the pandemic. Okay, as only 2 weeks ago has shown, the very strict lockdown in China does not only impede demand from a very important market in the world, but it also creates important supply bottlenecks touching upon a very large group of sectors. Secondly, the increase in our prices of energy and the second round effects. What we see, and especially, for example, in Belgium, prices are increasing, so employees are starting to ask higher wages in order to compensate for these price increases. These higher wages result in higher production costs. Companies will translate these higher production costs in higher prices, etc., etc., and then we're stuck in what we call, as economists, an inflationary spiral, which is very dangerous. And the third factor is, of course, the invasion in Ukraine. Nobody knows what Putin thinks. Nobody can see inside his head, and nobody knows what his next step will be, let alone what the consequences will be. What we know for today is that all these factors increase uncertainty in the market, which is detrimental to both consumer and both producer confidence. And these are very important variables, very, very important determinants for economic growth. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot for this intervention. It was a short one, and I know it wasn't easy to put all of this information just in 15 minutes, but I think it's a great start as an intro to the other topics. So thanks again a lot for your input. And if there would be any questions, I'm gonna refer them to our expert panel that comes afterwards. So thanks a lot, Cind, for this intervention. Thank you.
Bye.
Good.